This episode is sponsored by Displate. This is the log cabin that my dad and I built together. When we started, over 10 years ago now, we had almost no experience when it came to building log cabins. Sure, we knew our way around a tool belt, and we had completed several home renovations before, but building a log cabin was beyond our skill set, or so we felt. When I tried researching how to build a log cabin, I encountered loads of conflicting information. I realized that most of these sources didn't have any hands-on experience when it came to building log cabins. What they shared was either material regurgitated from other dubious sources, or they simply made broad assumptions based on their experiences in a different field. For example, many of the methods used to build a stick frame structure won't work for a log cabin. Sure, there's some overlap, but what works for one can't always be expected to work for the other. I quickly realized that log cabin building seemed to be a dying art form. Those who knew how to do it were long gone, and platforms like YouTube weren't as prolific with log cabin builds as they are now. In fact, when I started documenting our log cabin build on YouTube, ours was the first one on this platform. Sure, there were videos of log cabins being shown on YouTube, but not the actual build journey in its entirety, which I would have found very helpful. My dad and I began construction of our log cabin back in 2014. 3 years later, Sean James of Reliance began his in 2017, followed by Nik Rijavec in 2018, and Erik Grankvist in 2019, all of which are excellent builds by excellent craftsmen. Since then, countless other log cabin builds have begun on YouTube, which I find incredibly exciting. My point is that at the time, we didn't have the benefit of any of these builds to guide us in our own. So other than having Dick Prenicky as our inspiration, and some old photos of pioneer log cabins to study, we were on our own. Even though we learned much from Mr. Prenicky's example, we still had many unanswered questions when it came to the specifics of our build, especially when considering the differences between our geographies, climates, soil compositions, and available tree species, just to name a few. Finally, my dad and I settled on this. We'd know how to build a log cabin once we'd built one. It was then that I decided to document our journey and share it on YouTube, to show every single detail of our build and the reasoning behind our methodology. If we failed, then we'd be a cautionary tale to anyone who wanted to build their own log cabin. At least they'd know how not to do it. If we succeeded, then maybe in some small way we could breathe new life into an otherwise dying art form. But those reasons aside, getting to build a log cabin with my dad was reason enough. I by no means claim to be an expert log cabin builder, nor do I claim to definitively know the best way, since there are so many variables at play when it comes to building one. What I can do is show you how we build ours. So here's my top 10 list of things we did to build a log cabin that we're still proud of 10 years later. First of all, I started small. Before building the main log cabin with my dad, I built a much smaller, much more rustic bush cabin in the wilds of northern Ontario, Canada. This cabin didn't have a foundation, plumbing, or electricity. The notches were rough, the logs weren't debarked, and I used a rejected dining table for the door. But it was cozy, with its homemade waste oil stove, and spacious enough with a tiny main floor, loft, and smaller secondary loft for storage. More importantly, this tiny bush cabin helped me to gain some knowledge, confidence, and experience in the art of log cabin building. I learned as much about what worked as what didn't. Either way, I was learning. If it wasn't for my experience here, I don't think the main cabin build would have gone nearly as well. During the construction of the main log cabin, my dad and I also created what we call the pop-up cabin. Instead of logs, we used barn boards to build it, making it quick to assemble, disassemble, and transport when needed. We used the pop-up cabin as a tiny outpost while we worked on the main log cabin. I should mention that I do have the pop-up cabin plans for sale on my Teespring account, if you're interested. I've included a link in the description below. My point is that starting small was extremely helpful to us. It removed some of the guesswork when it came to the big build, and prevented us from making mistakes that we otherwise would have made. Perfect. Thanks. Starting small for you might be as simple as building your own bench. Get to know your tools and how to safely handle them. Talk to people who have experience in the field of construction, engineering, forestry, geology, and farming. Learn as much as you can from them because you never know what kind of information will help you down the road. The second decision I was glad we made about the log cabin build was the style of foundation we chose. When deciding what kind of foundation would be best for our off-grid build, we again were faced with so much conflicting information that it was almost paralyzing. Finally, I spoke with several local farmers who knew the soil better than anyone else. They said that if we dug down about 2 feet into the ground, we'd hit a stable layer of shale limestone, which wasn't affected by the annual frost heave. This was just the information we needed. Dig down to a stable layer and fill it with a stable material, like rock, which was the best and only option we had in our off-grid context. So after digging 9 holes down to the limestone layer, we filled each footing with fieldstone. Then we placed a boulder over top. In addition to keeping the cabin stable, the boulders also prevent rot by keeping the structure off the ground and away from excess moisture. We aimed for a minimum ground clearance of 16 inches, which we exceeded. 10 years later, the cabin hasn't shifted one bit and has remained rock steady. That's how I know we made the right choice with the foundation. I'd like to pause here for a moment to thank Displate for sponsoring this episode. At this point, the cabin interior is pretty much complete, except for one thing, my gallery wall. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Displate is a unique metal poster, which is a refreshing alternative to paper posters and canvas prints. There are over 2 million artworks available in the Displate catalog. Discover new, original art, or choose from officially licensed brands from the likes of Star Wars, Marvel, Call of Duty, and many other iconic brands and franchises, not to mention all the stunning nature photos they have available. As for me, I selected a series of pieces which feature warmly lit villages beneath the northern lights. Displate is also a platform for artists. Thousands of creators from all across the globe share their unique designs, paintings, and illustrations on metal canvas. It's tool-free, safe for your walls, and quick to install. The sticker leaf and magnet mount make it easy to hang and swap metal posters whenever you want. All Displate artwork is printed in the EU and should arrive anywhere within 4 to 5 business days. You can also order your artwork with Textra, an all-new finish that adds depth and texture to your Displates. Use my code OUTSIDER or hit the link in the description to get 25% off when you order 1 Displate, 32% off when you order 2 or 3, and 37% off when you buy 4 or more. The third decision we made about the log cabin that I'm grateful for is the species of tree we selected. Since we live in a cold climate, softwood evergreens are the obvious choice when it comes to building a log cabin. When I built the bush cabin, I was surrounded by pine trees, so I used those. For the main cabin build, we were surrounded mostly by white cedar, which I was disappointed with initially. White cedar has a high taper as opposed to pine, which makes it more difficult to build with. On average, the cedar logs that we used went from 16 inches in diameter at the base down to 9 inches at the tip. This 7-inch difference from end to end, paired with the fact that most cedars are slightly curved, make them more difficult to build with, and almost impossible to scribe. But as I spoke with local farmers and a forestry friend, I learned that white cedar has a huge advantage. Cedars are more acidic than other trees, and are therefore more resistant to bugs and rot, which is exactly why farmers in our area use cedar for their fence posts. It takes cedar forever to rot, even when they've been in the ground for decades. As my dad and I walked the ancient fence lines in my area, we found many cedar rails that were a century old. It was at that moment we knew white cedar was the right choice for our build. The fourth decision we made about the build that I'm grateful for is how we harvested the logs. Instead of clear-cutting a section of forest to gather the trees we needed, which would have been faster, we chose to selectively log. Think about it this way. Like the skillful pruning of a fruit tree increases its overall yield and health, so a skillful pruning of the forest helps to do the same. For example, thinning a crowded stand reduces the need for competition between the trees for nutrients, which reduces the chance of disease. The remaining trees, no longer crowded, are free to grow strong and healthy. Sunlight is also allowed to pierce through newly opened spots in the canopy. The golden rays reach down to the forest floor, where saplings and plants are given the fuel they need to sprout and flourish. The new vegetation will attract wildlife who will come to graze upon it, and so on. Ultimately, the entire ecosystem of the land is strengthened. My grandfather has selectively logged this tract of forest for over 75 years, which is why it's so healthy to this day. My dad and I continued in my grandfather's legacy of pruning the forest by only harvesting some of its cedars here and there, but never together in groups. The fifth decision we made about the log cabin build that I'm grateful for is the style of notches we chose. When researching which notch was best for our log cabin, I was once again flooded with confusing and contradictory information. When it comes down to it, there are three main methods used to join logs together at the corners of a cabin. Saddle notch, which is what we used, dovetail notch, which I love, and the butt and pass method, which is the easiest. The dovetail notch is my favorite. It's designed to be repeatable and is slanted in all the right ways to shed water away from the notch and to self-tighten. By the way, this is my friend, the Bearded Carpenter. He's another excellent craftsman that I greatly admire. The learning curve on the dovetail notch is a little higher than the others, but once you've mastered it, you've mastered them all, since it's a repeatable pattern. The saddle notch is what we ended up using. Like the dovetail, they shed water away from the notch, and to some extent, they will tighten slightly over time, although not nearly as well as the dovetail notch. The concept of the saddle notch is easier to learn, but ultimately takes more time to produce. This is because every saddle notch must be custom fit to the log below. If the fit isn't perfect, then there will be gaps, which is why it takes time to properly fit each saddle notch. But since the logs we used weren't uniform, we felt that there wasn't any sense in cutting a uniform notch for them, like the dovetail. So we settled on the saddle notch. As for the butt and pass method, the upside is that it's much quicker to build a cabin with this style, since the logs are simply butted together at the corners, ruling out the need for notches altogether, which I believe is a major downside to the butt and pass method. Interlocking notches gives strength to a log cabin in a way that butting the corners together simply can't do. And unlike the notch styles, the butt and pass method isn't designed to tighten over time or shed water away from the corners. The sixth decision we made about the log cabin build that I'm grateful for was to chink the cabin instead of scribe it. Scribing is where you cut or scribe the logs to fit snugly together along their length, so there aren't any gaps between them. A chinked cabin is built with gaps between the logs, which are later filled with mortar. Traditional log cabins in our area have always been chinked, probably because the high taper and slight curve of our local cedars make them hard to scribe. That's not to say that a chinked cabin is inferior to a scribed one by any means. They both can be built well or poorly depending on the craftsman who builds them. Consider this, although a scribed cabin is made to fit together without any gaps, it would be impossible to prevent it from having any, as small as they may be, especially as the logs settle and shrink with time and temperature. Most modern scribed cabins still need to be caulked along the seams to prevent this from happening, whereas a well-chinked cabin shouldn't have any gaps because the mortar does a great job at sealing them up. Before applying mortar to the gaps of our cabin, we first added hardwood blocks between the logs to stabilize the gaps since they don't shrink. So even as the logs themselves shrink and expand slightly over time, the gaps will remain constant because the hardwood blocks remain constant. This relieves a lot of stress on the mortar. Secondly, we reinforce the chinking by tacking metal lath between the gaps and applying mortar on top. Years later, the chinking looks as good as the day it was applied. Bottom line, I think both scribed and chinked cabins have their place. The seventh decision we made about the log cabin build that I'm grateful for was this: when in doubt, build strong. For example, when building the roof structure, my dad and I discussed whether or not we needed purlins, which are these big logs that span the length of the roof on both sides, between the peak and eaves. We figured that our roof would be strong enough without them, especially considering how steeply pitched it was. We assumed that any snow that fell onto the roof would slide off before it could accumulate to a dangerous weight. But we decided to follow the motto we'd been telling each other from day one: when in doubt, build strong. So we put the purlins in as extra support, and boy am I glad we did. This past winter, we had over 5 feet of snow accumulate on the cabin roof. Despite its steep pitch, the snow stubbornly refused to slide off, meaning that our log cabin had to carry over 25 tons of snow for most of the winter. During this time, I personally witnessed the aftermath of over a dozen structures that collapsed because of the snow load. Thankfully, no one was hurt. As for our log cabin, it held strong, without so much as a saggy rafter or even a single creak to be heard. It was this past winter that I became especially thankful for our motto, when in doubt, build strong. The eighth decision we made about the cabin build that I'm grateful for was to never treat the logs with anything. When debating about whether to treat the logs with some kind of preservative, I decided that the best and cheapest preservative was a good roof. So we built the roof with big overhangs, which does an excellent job at protecting the logs from rain and snow, even on a windy day. For this reason, the logs stay dry, which is the most important thing when it comes to their longevity. Sure, the logs will eventually turn from a golden brown to a silvery gray as they age, but they'll remain as solid as ever. I also believe that changing patina is a part of the log cabin's character and charm. The ninth decision we made about the cabin build that I'm grateful for was to spend as much time on the finer details as we did the big things. For example, I love that we took the time to make unique doors for the cabin, both front and back. Inlay pennies into the floorboards. Cut the bathroom sink from a stone. Install twig railings in the loft and front deck. Stone inlays for the deck posts. And a wagon wheel chandelier, which I found on my father's childhood homestead. All of these details took time, but they were worth it. Finally, the 10th decision we made about the log cabin build that I'm grateful for was to add as many comforts as we could. We decided from the very beginning that although this was an off-grid cabin, we wanted it to be as comfortable as possible for the family. So instead of having an outhouse, I built an inside washroom with compost toilet and running water. An outhouse would have been easier to build, but when it comes to using the toilet in the wintertime, or at night, or in the rain, it's so much nicer to have it inside. I also added a solar system to the cabin, which provides more than enough power to run the water, power the lights, including my Bass Pro lamp, and some smaller kitchen appliances. Well, there you have it. Over a decade of building condensed down into just 10 points. Now, of course, there's more to it than that, but I wanted to highlight the key decisions my dad and I made throughout the course of this build, which really helped shape the final product. And if I could go back 11 years ago now and give myself some pointers to help guide me in this build, I think it would be those 10 points. So hopefully you found them helpful. And if you want to see a deeper look, a more in-depth look at how we built this cabin, every single detail from the ground up, then I've included a playlist, a link to my playlist below, which is over 100 videos long, and you can watch that right here on YouTube. I've also got a 4-hour long video that you can watch in one sitting, which shows the build from start to finish. So if you're interested in log cabins, I recommend you check it out. You know, I think I'm going to add one more point to the list, an 11th point, and it is this. I'm so glad that we documented this build. My dad helped me build most of this cabin, but unfortunately he passed away before he could see the finished product. And I dearly miss him. There's not a day goes by that I don't think about him. But having this footage to go back on has been a comfort, it's been a blessing, especially the older videos. It helps me remember this amazing journey that I went on with my dad. It's fun to watch with my little girl, especially because she is now getting to know her grandfather through this footage. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Until next time, my friends, stay safe Be well, and God bless.